locked in a wagon crate for 3 days in the sun. A cowboy pried it open and gave her cold river water. The crowbar was already in my hand when I heard it. Not the creek, not the cottonwoods moving. Something underneath all that, a sound you don't reason out, you just stop for. I'd pulled off the trail to water the horses, and the freight wagon was sitting there in the switchgrass maybe 60 yards off the road like someone had aimed it at nothing and left it. No team, no driver. Both rear wheels sunk a good 4 inches into soft ground, which told me it hadn't moved in a while. Told me other things too, but I wasn't ready to think them yet. I stood by the creek with my hand on the crowbar I'd been using to reset a loose shoe, and I listened. 60 seconds went by, 70. Then it came again, a sound like something dragging itself across wood. Slow, barely there, the sound of something that had stopped expecting anybody to answer. I walked to the wagon. The crate was full-size freight, maybe 5 feet by 4, nailed shut from the outside with 10-penny nails spaced close. Recent nails. Someone had put care into it. There were air holes bored along the top, I could see that. Small ones, 6 of them maybe an inch across. And the wood on the south-facing side had gone dark with what the sun does to pine when the sun has been working it for days. I put my ear against the side panel. Nothing for a long moment. Then something shifted inside, a very quiet sound like the last of something. I had the first nail out in under a minute. The second bent came free sideways. By the third, I wasn't being careful anymore. Her name was Clara Voss. That's not the first thing I knew about her. The first thing I knew was that she weighed almost nothing when I caught her. She more or less fell out of the crate sideways when the panel came loose, and I got my arms under her before she hit the ground, but there wasn't much of her to stop. 26, maybe 27 years old. Brown hair matted flat, a traveling dress that had been blue once, lips cracked down the center. She didn't say anything. Her eyes were open, and she was looking at me, but I don't think she was seeing me yet, not really. I carried her to the creek. The water was cold. Mountain runoff cold, the kind that numbs your hands if you hold them in it long enough. I cupped it and brought it to her mouth a little at a time, not too much, not fast, because I knew better than that. And she drank what I gave her, and her hands came up after a while and held onto my wrist, not like she was grabbing me, just like she needed something to hold to. I let her hold it. I went back to the wagon and found what was in there with her. A carpet bag, small, a woman's hat with the brim crushed, a tin cup she'd clearly been using to try to catch what little air moved through the bore holes. That cup was what she'd been dragging. That was the sound I'd heard. There was a piece of paper nailed to the inside of the crate wall, and I took it down. Read it there by the wagon, and then folded it and put it in my shirt pocket, and didn't say anything about it yet. I went back to her. She was sitting up by then, her feet in the water. Didn't look at me when I came back, just stared at the creek. Her breathing was still shallow, but it was regular. I built a small fire, not for warmth. July wasn't cold, but because people need something to look at, I've always found. Something that moves, something that isn't just the inside of their own head. I made coffee, and I gave her the first cup. She held it with both hands for a long time before she drank any. 3 days, she said. Just that, nothing else for a while. I know, I said. She looked at me then, really looked. You can tell when someone's actually seeing you versus going through the motion of it. Her eyes steadied and took me in, and something in her face shifted, not to relief exactly, more like she was deciding whether I was going to be another problem or not. I let her decide. After a while, she drank the coffee. My name is Eli Brooke, and at the time none of this happened, I was 53 years old and working a courier route between the Dunmore Freight Depot and a string of mining camps in the high country. Not glamorous work, mostly solitary, which suited me fine because I'd been mostly solitary for about 8 years by then and had gotten comfortable in it, the way a man does with a coat that fits him, even if it isn't a particularly warm coat. I had a horse named Gracie and a mule named whatever I felt like calling him that week. I rotated through names, and he ignored all of them equally, which is pretty much the ideal relationship with a mule. I had a bedroll and a kit bag and a colt that I hadn't drawn in 2 years, and I knew every stream and every shortcut and every bad stretch of road between the depot and the high camps, and that was what I was worth to the men who paid me, and it was enough. I wasn't looking for anything more than that. I want to be clear about that, not as an excuse for what happened. Nothing that happened needed excusing, but because a man at 53 who's been on his own for most of a decade doesn't generally go looking for his life to change. He's past the part where he believes it will. You learn to stop expecting things, and the upside is you stop getting disappointed, and the cost of that is you also stop thinking anything good is still coming for you. I had accepted that cost, or thought I had. The paper I'd taken from the crate wall had 2 names on it. A man's name, Delmore Prout, and a town, Cascabel, which was 2 days south. The writing was careful, not angry, which made it worse somehow. Just a man writing down what he'd done and where he'd left the result, like he was keeping records. The crate had a shipping label on the outside, addressed to a ranch I knew, the Hollies Spread, 14 miles east. I delivered there twice. Old Clem Hollies ran cattle and had 2 grown sons and a reputation for doing whatever he wanted to do and not being stopped about it. I folded the label too and put it with the paper. Clara drank a second cup of coffee, and then she looked at the tin cup she'd been carrying in that crate for 3 days, and she set it very carefully in the grass beside her like it was something she was putting down for good. He was going to sell me, she said. I didn't ask who, I didn't need to. My husband, Delmore, she paused. Former husband, he stopped being my husband when he put the lid on. That was how she said it. Flat and settled, the way women say things when they've had time to get past the feeling and down to the fact. Hollies, I said. She looked at me sharp. You know him. Know of him. Delmore owed him money, had for 2 years. Hollies came to collect and Delmore didn't have it. She picked a piece of grass and turned it in her fingers. I was what Delmore had. I sat with that for a moment. You have people somewhere? I asked. My sister in Tule Creek. I knew Tule Creek. It was north, the direction I wasn't going, but knowing where it was and where I wasn't going didn't change anything. I looked at Gracie grazing by the water, and I looked at the mule watching me with his habitual expression of mild contempt, and I thought about what I was going to do, and it didn't take as long to decide as you might think. I'll take you to your sister, I said. She studied me. A long, steady study, the kind where a person is measuring something they can't ask about directly. Why, she said. Because there's nowhere else for you to go right now, and I know the road to Tule Creek. That's not a reason, she said. That's a route. She was right. I thought about it another moment. Because I found you, I said, so now you're my concern. She didn't say anything to that, but she stopped looking for the catch in it, and that was enough. We made 4 miles the first afternoon. Slow going, I put her on Gracie and walked, and even so she was gripping the saddle horn more than she'd probably like to admit. 3 days with no water and no food and very little air does something to a person that rest and a creek and 2 cups of coffee doesn't fully undo. We stopped at a wide place in the trail where a limestone shelf made a natural windbreak, and I set up camp and made a proper meal, cornmeal mush and salt pork and more coffee. And she ate slowly and deliberately, the way you eat when you're not sure your body's ready to handle it yet. I didn't talk much, never have been a man who fills silence for the sake of it. She asked me about the route, how many days, what the road was like, whether we'd passed through any towns. I answered straight. She listened carefully, like she was making a map in her head. I respected that. She wasn't looking for comfort. She was looking for information. There's a kind of sense in a woman like that, a practical sense, that I had always admired without knowing quite how to say so. After we ate, she washed her face and her hands at the small spring behind the limestone shelf, and she came back looking more like herself, whatever herself was. She sat down across the fire from me and looked at it for a while. Eli Brooke, she said. That's right. You deliver freight. I do. You're not with anyone? She asked it carefully, not because she was prying, I thought, but because she was still doing her accounting of the situation, making sure she understood the terms. No, I said. She nodded. I had a wife, I said. I don't know why I said it. It was 8 years gone and I didn't generally volunteer it. Fever took her, 61. She looked up at me across the fire. I'm sorry, she said. And then, after a moment, that's a long time to be alone. It is, I said. I hadn't said that to anyone before, not because it wasn't true, but because no one had asked, and I hadn't seen the point in saying it to the air. Something about the way she'd said it, not as pity, not as a pleasantry, just as a plain acknowledgement of a plain fact, made it possible to answer the same way. I'm sorry about your husband, I said. What he did. Don't be sorry about Delmore, she said. Save your sorry for something worth it. I almost smiled. I hadn't almost smiled in a good while. Day 2 was hard going. The road climbed into broken country west of the river, and Gracie had to work for it, and the mule was his usual self. The sun was high and hot, and I walked with my hat pulled low, and my mind turning over things I hadn't thought about in a long time. Not about her, or not only about her, about the paper in my pocket, about Holly's, about what he thought was happening right now, which was probably that a crate he'd paid for was somewhere between the freight road and his ranch, and it was taking longer than expected. He wouldn't know I'd found it, wouldn't know for a few days yet maybe, but he'd know eventually. And Delmore Prout would know his arrangement had gone sideways, and he wouldn't know why. That left Clara in a position I didn't like to think about too long. Around noon, she said, "You've been quiet in a different way this morning." I looked up at her. She was watching me from the saddle with her hands easy on the reins, the crushed hat back on her head, doing its minimal job against the sun. "Thinking," I said. "About what?" I told her about the paper, about the shipping label, all of it. She deserved to know the full shape of it, and she was the kind of woman you could tell the full shape of things to and trust her to hold it steady. She was quiet for a while after that. "Delmore won't come after me," she said finally. "He's a coward. He'll tell himself I'm someone else's problem now." She paused. "Holly's might if he thinks he's been cheated." "I know," I said. "You knew that this morning." "I did." She looked at me again with that measuring look. "You didn't change course?" "No." "Why not?" "Same reason as before," I said. She turned back to the trail. A long quiet, just the wind and Gracie's hooves and the mule plodding behind. "You're a stubborn man, Eli Brooke," she said. "Steady," I said. "There's a difference." She thought about that. "I suppose there is," she said. We came into the first town that evening, a two-street place called Marrow Flat, which had a general store and a livery and a boarding house with a widow who ran it named Estrada, a sharp-eyed woman who looked us over once and decided she wasn't going to ask questions and charged us fare for 2 rooms and supper. I was grateful for the lack of questions. Small towns talk, and I didn't want word moving ahead of us. I bought Clara a change of clothes at the general store, not because she asked, she didn't, but because a woman who's been in a freight crate for 3 days shouldn't have to stay in the dress that came out of it if there's a store 20 feet away. I handed her the package without ceremony, and she took it the same way. "I'll pay you back," she said. "No need." "I will, though." I let her have that. People need to pay their debts, or at least intend to. It keeps the dignity intact. We ate supper at a long table in the boarding house kitchen with 2 traveling salesmen, and a family of 4 passing through on their way to Utah. Clara sat across from me and ate everything on her plate and listened to the salesman nearest her talk about his line of dry goods with polite interest, and I watched her and thought, there it is. That's who she is. A woman who can sit across a table from strangers the day after stepping out of a freight crate and find something to be genuinely curious about. I ate my supper and didn't say much. After in the hall, she stopped at her door and looked back at me. "Thank you," she said, "for today, for all of it." "You don't have to keep thanking me," I said. "I know I don't have to." She held my eyes for a moment. "Good night, Eli." "Good night, Clara." I went to my room and lay down and looked at the ceiling for a long time before I slept. 3 things happened in Marrow Flat that I didn't count on. The first was that when I went to the livery in the morning to check on Gracie and the mule, the livery man told me a rider had come through late the previous night asking about a man and a woman traveling north, and had the livery man seen them. The livery man had said no, because he hadn't seen them arrive. We'd come in after he'd closed up, but the description was close enough that I knew who the rider was looking for. Someone from the Hollies outfit. I checked the mule's shoes and tried to decide how to play this. The second thing was that when I came back to the boarding house, Clara was in the kitchen helping Mrs. Estrada with breakfast, and Mrs. Estrada was talking to her with the ease of a woman talking to someone she'd known for years, and Clara was laughing at something, a real laugh, and I stood in the doorway for a moment watching that without meaning to. There was a quality to her face when she laughed, not girlish, not performed, just open, clear, like a day with no weather in it. I looked away before she saw me looking. The third thing was that when I told her about the rider, Over breakfast after the salesman and the Utah family had left, she set down her fork and was quiet for a count of 10 and then said, "How much of a lead do we need?" Not what do we do, not I'm frightened. How much of a lead do we need? Half a day, I said, more if we can get it. Then we should eat fast, she said, and picked her fork back up. We made good time that day, better than I expected. The road north of Marrow Flat was hard-packed and the grade was mostly easy, and I put Clara on the mule, who was better built for long days even if he was harder to like, and rode Gracie myself for a while, which let us cover ground faster. We stopped twice to water the animals and once to eat, cold, jerky, and hardtack, and the last of the coffee from the morning, drunk cold out of the canteen, which Clara drank without complaint. She told me about Tule Creek, while we walked the midday stretch to spare the animals. About her sister Nora, who'd married a farmer named Hatch and had 2 little boys and a vegetable patch she was unreasonably proud of. About growing up in Missouri, which she'd left at 20 to marry Delmore Prout, who had seemed like a different kind of man than he turned out to be. She said that the way you say a thing when you're past the worst of the feeling about it and can see the outline of it clearly. What did he seem like? I asked. Bold, she said. Decisive, like he knew what he wanted and wasn't going to wait for it. She paused. Turns out there's a version of that's good and a version that's just a man who takes what he wants and doesn't think about what happens to the thing he took. Yes, I said. We walked a while. What was your wife like? She asked. It was a direct question, but it didn't feel like prying. It felt like she'd been deciding whether to ask it for a while and had decided she'd rather know. Steady, I said. Same as me, I guess, but warmer, more words than me. She could talk to anyone, same as you, I noticed at the boarding house. You noticed that? I did. Her name? Ruth. She said the name quietly, like she was receiving it properly. She sounds like someone worth missing, she said. She was, I said. We walked a while more. The road climbed a small rise, and from the top of it you could see 20 miles of country laid out to the north, pale gold and green under a high blue sky. Clara pulled the mule up and looked at it for a moment. It's something, isn't it? She said. It is, I said. And we went on. We camped that night on the north side of the rise, in a stand of ponderosas where a spring came out of the rock cold and clear and tasted of iron and stone. I made a fire and cooked the last of the salt pork with some wild onions I'd pulled up along the road, and the smell of it was good in the cold night air. After we ate, Clara took the tin cup she'd carried out of the crate. She'd kept it. I'd noticed in her carpet bag and filled it from the spring and held it in both hands. I'm going to throw this in the river when we cross the Burrow, she said. That was the river we'd be hitting the next day. Why not now? I asked. Because I want to throw it in moving water, she said. Something that'll carry it away. I understood that. Some things need to be carried off. You need to see them go. She looked at me across the fire. Can I ask you something? She said. Go ahead. Why are you kind? I thought about how to answer that. It wasn't a question I'd been asked before, not directly. I don't know that I am particularly, I said. I just do what seems like the right thing. Most men don't, she said. It wasn't bitterness. It was just an accounting of what she'd seen. Some do, I said. Some, she agreed. Not enough. She turned the cup in her hands. You could have kept writing when you heard me. You could have told yourself it wasn't your business. Most would have. I heard you, I said. That made it my business. She looked at me with that steady look she had, the one that saw what it was looking at. I'm glad it was you, she said. That found me. I felt that settle somewhere in my chest and stay there. So am I said. The Burrow River was running fast from the spring melt, brown and cold, knee-deep on the horses at the ford. I went through first to check the bottom, then came back for Clara and the mule, and we crossed together, all 4 of us working against the current. And on the north bank, Clara reached into her bag and pulled out the tin cup and held it out over the water and let it go. It hit the surface and went sideways and went under and was gone in 3 seconds. She watched the place where it had been. All right, she said. Then she turned the mule north and didn't look back. I liked that too. She made up her mind and then she was done with the thing. We were 2 days from Tule Creek. The trouble came the second afternoon past the Burrow, on a wide, flat section of road where there was no cover and nowhere to go. 3 riders coming south at a walk, which meant they weren't in a hurry, which meant they weren't lost or passing through. They'd positioned themselves across the road before we saw them, which meant they'd come the back way and gotten ahead of us. I knew one of them, Carl Steen. Worked the Hollies ranch for years, good with a gun and willing to use it and not particular about who he used it on. Brooke, he said when we got close enough, like he knew me. He did a little. We'd had dealings twice and they'd been fine, because the dealings had been business and not this. Steen, I said, you found something that belongs to Mr. Hollies. I kept my hands easy and my face easy. Found a woman locked in a crate, I said. That's what I found, in case you're accounting for it differently. He didn't like that. One of the men with him, young, big, nervous, moved his hand toward his gun. I looked at him until he moved his hand back. Mr. Hollies paid for her, Steen said. Paid good money. Didn't pay her, I said. Which is the problem? That's between Mr. Hollies and her husband. Former husband, Clara said from behind me. Her voice was level, not loud. He stopped having any say over me when he put me in that box. And Mr. Hollies never had any. Steen looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not sympathy. Steen wasn't built for sympathy, but calculation. He was thinking about what this looked like if it went badly. 3 men killing a woman on a public road. Men did worse and got away with it, but it had a cost. I let him think. You're making an enemy of Clem Hollies, he said to me. I've had enemies before, I said. Haven't had any that killed me yet. Another long silence. The nervous young man looking back and forth between Steen and me. Walk away, Brooke, Steen said. You don't have a stake in this. I looked at him steadily. She's with me, I said. That's my stake. He held my eyes, 10 seconds, 15. Then he turned his horse, the other 2 followed. They rode south without looking back. Clara didn't say anything for a minute. Then she came up alongside me, the mule's shoulder even with Gracie's. Will they try again? She asked. Maybe, I said. Hollies doesn't usually let things go. She rode beside me for a while. I'm sorry, she said, that you're in this because of me. I'm in this because I choose to be, I said. There's a difference there, too. She looked at me for a moment with something in her face that wasn't quite the measuring look, wasn't quite the clear open look. Something between them. Yes, she said, there is. Tule Creek was a real town, small but real, 2 churches, a mill, a proper main street with a hardware and a druggist and a hotel. I asked at the hotel for the Hatch place and got directions without trouble. Clara was quiet riding through the main street, looking at things, and I thought, this is what a person looks like when they're close to being somewhere safe, like they're afraid to believe it yet. We found the farm 2 miles out on the east road. Good land, well kept, a vegetable garden to the south side of the house that was indeed something to see, staked and tied and green, orderly rows of it. A woman came out onto the porch before we reached the gate. She was younger than Clara by several years and had the same brown hair, and she stood on that porch and looked at her sister coming up the road on a mule, and her hand went to her mouth, and she came off the porch at a run. I pulled up and got out of the way. It was something to watch, the kind of reunion that happens when someone thought they might not ever see the person again. Clara got off the mule and the 2 of them held each other in the yard and didn't say anything for a long time. The mule watched with his usual expression. I watched the road. Eventually they pulled apart and Clara said something to her sister, and her sister looked at me, and Clara came back to where I was standing with the horses. She wants you to stay for supper, she said. I should get back on the road, I said. Eli. The way she said it made me look at her. She was standing in the afternoon light with the wind moving the hair that had come loose from under the hat. And she was looking at me the way she'd been looking at me since the camp 2 nights ago, directly, steadily, seeing what she was looking at and not pretending otherwise. Stay for supper, she said. I stayed for supper. Nora Hatch was a good cook and a curious woman, and her husband Tom was quiet and decent, and shook my hand with a grip that told me he worked hard and didn't resent it. The 2 boys, 4 and 6, were loud at the table in the specific way of boys that age and ignored by their parents with the specific practiced ease of parents who have learned what to ignore. It was a good table. It had been a long time since I'd sat at a table like that. After supper, Tom took the boys in for their bath and Nora made coffee, and then made herself busy with the dishes in a way that was very obviously giving Clara and me the back of the kitchen, and I would have been amused by it if I hadn't been trying to figure out what I wanted to say. Clara sat across from me with her coffee. "Where do you go from here?" she asked. "Back to the route," I said. "Dunmore to the high camps, same as before." She nodded, and Holly's. "I'll send word to the marshal in Cascabel. What happened to you is a crime. What Prout did is a crime. Holly's commissioned it." I paused. "May not amount to much, but I'll send the word." "I'd like that," she said. A long quiet, Nora clanking dishes on the other side of the kitchen. "I have a good life here," Clara said. "Or I will. Nora wants me to stay. There's a schoolhouse in town that needs a teacher, she says." "Good," I said. "It's a small life," she said, "but it's mine." "That's the best kind," I said. She looked at her coffee cup, not the old tin cup, a proper china cup from Nora's cupboard. She turned it slightly in her hands. "You could come back through," she said, "when your route takes you north." I looked at her. She was looking at the cup, and then she looked up at me, and whatever she was feeling, she wasn't hiding it. A woman like Clara doesn't perform things. What's there is what's there. "The route takes me north every few weeks," I said. "Every few weeks," she said. "If it would be all right," I said. "To stop." "It would be all right," she said. Nora dropped something in the sink and said something under her breath that was probably not meant for us to hear, but I think was an expression of satisfaction. Clara's mouth curved very slightly at the corner. Mine did too, though I probably would have denied it. We sat at that table until the lamp burned low, and we talked about the road and the territory and the school and the garden and the two boys and Ruth and what Missouri had been like, and what the high camps were like in November when the snow came. The things people talk about when they're getting to know each other. The slow, good work of it. I left early the next morning. Clara was up before the sun. She had coffee ready, which I hadn't expected, and she handed me a cup at the kitchen door while the horses were still hitched out front, and the sky was just beginning to go pale at the edges. We stood on the porch. "Be careful on the road," she said. "I know the road," I said. "I know you do." She put her hand on my arm, not holding on. Just resting there, her hand on my forearm, and she looked at me in the early morning light with that clear-eyed, steady look she had, the one that saw what it was looking at and wasn't going to say anything that wasn't true. "You gave me water when I needed it," she said. "You brought me home. You stood between me and Steen, and you didn't have to, and you did it anyway." She paused. "I see who you are, Eli Brooke. I want you to know that." I stood there with her hand on my arm and the pale light coming up over the eastern hills, and I thought about 8 years of a life that fit like a coat that kept most of the cold out, but not all of it. And I thought about a woman who had the particular kind of courage that lives quiet and hard in the core of a person and doesn't need to announce itself. "Few weeks," I said. "Few weeks," she said. She took her hand off my arm. She went back inside. I stood on the porch for another moment and drank my coffee down to the bottom, and then I walked to the horses. The road south was the same road as ever, same ruts, same switchgrass, same pale sky, and the same early summer smell of sage and dry earth baking. Gracie walked easy because she knew the way. The mule walked with his habitual indifference to everything around him, which I found, that morning, less irritating than usual. I had been 53 years old when I pried that crate open, and I had been alone for 8 years, and I had thought that was how it was going to stay because I had stopped expecting otherwise. I want to be clear that I was not a man in the habit of expecting things to change. But here's what I knew coming off that farm. There was a woman in Tule Creek who had looked straight at me and said, "I see who you are," and she hadn't said it soft or made it into something larger than it was. She'd said it the way you say a true thing. And she was going to be teaching school in a few weeks and growing her own life back out of the wreck of the one she'd had. And she was going to be fine because she was the kind of person who gets fine. And in a few weeks, I was going to ride back through. That was all it was, but it was something. It was something I hadn't had in a long time. The sun came up full and bright behind me, throwing my shadow out long and thin on the road ahead. The mule walked on. Gracie walked on. I touched my hat brim out of no particular reason, except that it was a good morning. And I rode north.